Um, Good morning, and we're now going to continue our discussion on simultaneous change in demand and supply and its effect to equilibrium condition. Um, in the last video, we already have explored about the simultaneous change in demand and supply, specifically when the change in demand exceeds the change in supply. This time, I will focus on the market condition where the change in supply exceeds the change in demand. When we say that the change in supply is greater than the change in demand, that is to say that the amount of change in supply is bigger than the amount of change in demand. Like if both the supply and demand increase, and let's say we have an increase in supply by 10 units, while the increase in demand is only 5 units. So the increase in supply in this particular situation exceeds the increase in demand. And considering these two forces in the market, the demand and supply, the demand has more influence to the direction of price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium. So if we say that the change in supply exceeds the change in demand, this is the situation where the supply force has more influence over the direction of the price equilibrium and the quantity equilibrium. And in this case, we're going to use the relationship between the change in supply and the change in price equilibrium, or between the change in supply and its relationship to quantity equilibrium. Specifically, we have last time learned that the change in supply is directly related to the change in quantity equilibrium, so that if there is an increase in supply, quantity equilibrium will also increase. And we also have learned that the change in supply and price equilibrium are inversely related, so that if there is an increase in supply, the price equilibrium decreases. So we will now deal with this particular market condition through a given problem. So let us consider this problem that will illustrate a market condition where the change in supply exceeds the change in demand. And reading this problem, the original demand and supply equations are QD equal to 72.5 minus 12.5 P, and QS is equal to negative 25 plus 15 P respectively. Solve for the new price and quantity equilibrium given that after a time period there exists a simultaneous increase in demand by 10 units and increase in supply by 15 units. So from this given problem statement, we can observe that both the demand and supply have increased. But the increase in supply of 15 units exceeds the increase in demand of 10 units. Thus, what that has the greater change is the supply side, and therefore the supply side can influence more of the direction of the price equilibrium and the direction of the quantity equilibrium. So what could be the expected direction of price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium? Given that the increase in supply exceeds the increase in demand, the price equilibrium decreases and the quantity equilibrium increases. Let us prove this by interpreting the given market situation. But first we have to derive the new demand equation from a given original demand equation and the amount of change in demand. So in order to derive the new demand equation, we have to add the change in demand from the original demand equation. So that the new demand equation is QD1 plus change in demand, where the QD1 refers to the original demand equation. And the original demand equation is given by 72.5 minus 12.5 P, while the change in demand is an increase in demand by 10 units, so that we will introduce the plus 10. Plus because the change in demand is an increase in demand by 10 units. So the new demand equation now is 72.5 minus 12.5 P plus 10. And to simplify, we have 82.5 minus 12.5 P. This is also our procedure in terms of deriving the new supply equation. So the new supply equation can be derived by adding the change in supply from the original supply equation. And given that our original supply equation is negative 25 plus 15P, adding to it the change in supply, which is increased by 15 units, then we will introduce plus 15. Plus because it is increased. Now, so QS1 plus 15 is our new supply equation, where QS1 refers to the original supply equation. So that the new supply equation now is negative 25 plus 15P plus 15, where the new or the original supply equation is negative 25 plus 15P. So to simplify, our new supply equation now is negative 10 plus 15P. Now that we have our original demand and supply equations and new demand and supply equations, we can now derive mathematically the value of the original price equilibrium and the value of the new price equilibrium. In the past, in the last video that we have watched, we already have dealt with how the original price equilibrium can be solved and how the new price equilibrium can be solved. But anyway, so that we can become more familiar of the process, solving the original price equilibrium necessitates equating the original supply equation to the original demand equation, so that QS1 is equal to QD1, where QS1 is negative 25 plus 15P and QD1 is 72.5 minus 12.5P. Now, bringing those terms with P to the left side of the equality sign and the whole numbers to the right side of the equality sign, then we have now 15P plus 12.5P equals 72.5 plus 25. Now, to add the coefficient of P, 15 plus 12.5 is 27.5. So the coefficient now of P is 27.5. And adding the whole number 72.5 plus 25 will become 97.5. So that is 27.5 equals 97.5. And solving for P, therefore, we have to get the quotient of 97.5 and 27.5. So 97.5 divided by 27.5 will give us a quotient of 3.54. Now the quotient of 3.54 refers to the value of our price equilibrium. And what price equilibrium? This is the original price equilibrium, because what we have equated are the original supply equation and the original demand equation. So we can also solve for the new price equilibrium by equating the new supply equation to the new demand equation. And our new supply equation is given by negative 10 plus 15p, while our new demand equation is given by 82.5 minus 12.5p. So equating the two equations, we now have 15p plus 12.5p equals 82.5 plus 10. And bringing all those terms with p to the left side of the equality sign, we now have 15p plus 12.5p is equal to 82.5 plus 10. Now, simplifying, we now have 27.5p equals to 92.5. And so we can solve for P as the quotient of 92.5 and 27.5. So 97.5 divided by 27.5 gives us the price equilibrium equal to 3.36. So this computed price equilibrium of 3.36 is the new price equilibrium, because what we have equated are the new supply equation and the new demand equation. Now, since we already have the values of the new price equilibrium and the value of original price equilibrium, then we can be able to compute for the change in price equilibrium. And the change in price equilibrium is just the difference between the new price equilibrium and the original price equilibrium, so that the new price equilibrium is equal to 3.36 and the original price equilibrium is 3.54. Their difference is negative 0.18. So this difference of 0.18 negative is the change in price equilibrium. Negative because there is a decrease in price equilibrium by 18 centavos. So if we look at the graph, notice that the gap between the original supply curve and the new supply curve is bigger than the gap between the new demand curve and the original demand curve. So this gap, whether big or small, actually would tell us of how big the change is graphically. So since the gap between the original supply and the new supply curves is bigger than the gap between the new demand curve and the original demand curves, then we say that the change in supply is greater than the change in demand. So how can we be able to find for the equilibrium point between the between the lines? Now, take note that the equilibrium point original is the point of intersection between the original demand curve and the original supply curve. So that is the point of intersection between QD1 and QS1. So at this point of intersection, it means that QD 1 is equal to QS1. And the corresponding price of this equilibrium point refers to the original price equilibrium, while the point of intersection between the new demand curve and the new supply curve refers to the new equilibrium point, and their corresponding price and quantity values are 3.36 and 40.5 respectively. So notice that the price equilibrium has decreased from 3.54 to 3.36, a decrease of about 18 centavos. So how can we interpret this? It means to say that because of the increase in both the demand and the supply, given that the supply has greater increase than the increase in demand, what will happen to the prevailing price in the market is to decrease by 18 centavos. That is from 3.54 to a price of 3.36. But the quantity equilibrium actually increases from 28.25 to 40.5 as shown on the illustration, graphical illustration. Next slide will tell us of the computation of the quantity equilibrium given the same market condition. So here, the quantity equilibrium can be solved by simply using the demand equation as our reference and substituting to it the value of the substituting to the P of the demand equation the value of the price equilibrium, so that for the original quantity equilibrium we can use the original demand equation as our reference, and also we can use the value of the computed original price equilibrium of 3.54 to P of the original demand equation. Given the original demand equation of 72.5 minus 12.5 P, substituting to it the original price equilibrium, we now have 72.5 minus 12.5 times 3.54. So to simplify, we now have 72.5 minus 44.25, and it will give us a values of 28.25 as the quantity equilibrium value. Now this is the original quantity equilibrium because what we have used are the original demand equation and the original price equilibrium. So that is the same way we will solve for the new quantity equilibrium. This time what we will be making use is the new demand equation as our reference equation. And to substitute to the P of this new demand equation, the new price equilibrium of 3.36. So let us now simplify the equation. Since the original the new demand equation is 82.5 minus 12.5 P, and substituting to it the new price equilibrium of 3.36, we now can have 82.5 minus 12.5 times 3.36, and simplifying, the value of 40.5 can be derived, and this value of 40.5 refers to the value of quantity equilibrium, specifically new quantity equilibrium. So the change in quantity equilibrium can now be solved by the difference between the original quantity equilibrium and a new quantity equilibrium. Specifically, new quantity equilibrium minus the original quantity equilibrium. So, the new quantity equilibrium is 40.5 and the original quantity equilibrium is 28.25. So, new quantity equilibrium minus original quantity equilibrium is 40.5 minus 28.25, which will give us a value of 12.25 units. And this is positive. The fact that the sign is positive, it means that there is an increase in quantity equilibrium. So notice that because of the simultaneous increase in the demand and the supply, and given that the increase in supply exceeds the increase in demand, price equilibrium decreases but quantity equilibrium increases. So let us try having a new market situation. This time, there still is a simultaneous change in demand and supply, but demand here decreases and supply increases. So simultaneously there is a decrease in demand and increase in supply. Now let us refer to the problem statement. The original demand and supply equations are QD equal to 72.5 minus 12.5P, and QS is equal to negative 25 plus 15.5, or rather QS is equal to negative 25 plus 15P respectively. Solve for the new price and quantity equilibrium given that after a time period there exists a simultaneous decrease in demand by 10 units and the increase in supply by 22 units. So notice that the change in demand here is 10 and the change in supply is 22, regardless whether the changes increase or decrease. The fact that the change in supply is 22 and while the change in demand is 10, the change in supply is greater than the change in the demand because 22 is greater than 10. So let us now be specific to what are these changes. Change in supply is increase in supply by 22 units, while change in demand is decrease in demand by 10 units. So if we're going to use this data so that we can derive the new demand and supply equations, what we have to do is to add the change in demand or the change in supply to their corresponding original equation. So for the new demand equation, we can add a change in demand from the original demand equation. And the change in demand is negative 10. Negative because there is a decrease in demand by 10 units. And the original demand equation is given by the equation 72.5 minus 12.5P. So that the new demand equation now is 72.5 minus 12.5P minus 10. And to simplify, it will give us the new demand equation of 62.5 minus 12.5P. So this is also the way we can solve for the new supply equation. The new supply equation can be derived by adding the change in supply from the original supply equation. And the fact that the change in supply is increased by 22 units, so we will introduce plus 20. And given that the QS1 refers to the original supply equation, and that the original supply equation is given by the equation negative 25 plus 15P. So the new supply equation now can be change in supply, or rather original supply curve, or rather original supply equation plus the change in supply. And this is now equal to negative 25 plus 15p plus 22. And to simplify further, the new supply equation now is equal to negative 3 plus 15p. So, just the same way how the price equilibrium was computed based from the past explained slides, our original price equilibrium is 3.54 because we used the same original equations. And the new supply equations and demand equations can now give us the value of the new price equilibrium. So equating the new supply equation to the new demand equation, we have negative 3 plus 15p is equal to 62.5 minus 12.5p. And to solve for p, we can now have this value of 2.38. The 2.38 is now the price equilibrium value, the new price equilibrium. So new price equilibrium because what we have used as our equations are the original supply equation, rather the new supply equations and the new demand equations. So we equated the new supply equation QS2 to the new demand equation QD2. Now that we have these original and new price equilibrium values, we can change the we can compute for the change in price equilibrium, which is new price equilibrium minus original price equilibrium. The new price equilibrium is 2.38, while the original price equilibrium is 3.54. So getting the difference will give us the value of negative 1.16 pesos. So that means to say the price equilibrium decreases by 1.16 pesos when there exists a simultaneous increase in supply and decrease in demand. The fact that the increase in supply of 22 units is bigger than the decrease in demand of 10 units. Graphically, you will notice here that the change in supply, which is reflective of the wider gap between the new supply curve and the original supply curve. Comparing it to the gap between the new demand curve and the original demand curve. So we have a bigger gap between supply curves and a smaller gap between demand curves. And thus, we can say the change in supply exceeds the change in demand. And of course, finding for the equilibrium point, the original equilibrium point is between the intersection of the QS sub 1 and QD sub 1. So at that point of intersection, we say QD sub 1 is equal to QS sub 1. QD sub 1 being the original demand curve and QS sub 1 being the original supply curve. So at that point of intersection, the corresponding price is 3.54 and the corresponding quantity is 28.25. Now to find for the new quantity, new equilibrium point, the new equilibrium point is between or is the point of intersection between the new demand curve and the new supply curve. So that's between QD2 and QS2. And at this particular point where QD2 is equal to QS2, the corresponding price is 2.38. So that means to say the price was 3.54 and now it becomes 2.38. So there is a decrease in price equilibrium by 1.16 pesos. So the negative 1.16 as the value between the difference of the original price equilibrium and the new price equilibrium states that there is an increase, or rather there is a decrease in the price equilibrium by 1.16 pesos, and this is due to the simultaneous decrease in demand by 10 units and increase in supply by 22 units. In the next slide, what to be shown is simply how the quantity equilibrium original and quantity equilibrium new will be solved. So without further explaining the process of getting to the value of the original quantity equilibrium and new quantity equilibrium, since we are already familiar of the procedure, we can just now highlight on how much the change in quantity equilibrium is. So the change in quantity equilibrium is positive 4.5 units. Positive because the new quantity equilibrium is greater than the original quantity equilibrium. The new quantity equilibrium is 32.75, while the original quantity equilibrium is only 28.25. So there is now a difference of positive 4.5 units. Positive means that there is an increase in quantity equilibrium by 4.5 units. So you'll notice that given the dominance of the change in supply to the change in demand, what will prevail is the relationship between change in demand and price equilibrium, or the relationship between change in supply and quantity equilibrium. Specifically, there is an inverse relationship between the change in demand and price equilibrium, so that there is an inverse relationship rather between the change in supply and the price equilibrium, so that given the increase in supply, there will be expected decrease in price equilibrium. And so the increase in supply by 22 units, which is far greater than the decrease in demand by 10 units, will bring about a decrease in price equilibrium from 3.54 to 2.38, and an increase in quantity equilibrium from 28.25 to 32.75. So let us now go to the next slide, and the next slide will focus on the market condition. Still again, change in supply exceeds the change in demand here, but there is now a decrease in supply and there is an increase in demand. A while ago, what we have analyzed is increase in supply exceeding decrease in demand, but this time decrease in supply exceeding increase in demand. So knowing the relationships between change in demand or the change in supply to price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium, we can say now that given the decrease in supply exceeds the increase in demand, both price equilibrium and quantity equilibrium will decrease. And let us prove this through the solution that we can give to the problem statement stating that the original demand and supply equations are QD equal to 72.5 minus 12.5P and QS is negative 25 plus 15P respectively. Solve for new price and quantity equilibrium given that after a time period there exists a simultaneous increase in demand by 10 units and decrease in supply by 20 units. So notice that the change in supply is 20 units while the change in demand is only 10 units. So we can now infer that the change in supply is greater than the change in demand, regardless whether the changes increase or decrease. So before we can proceed to solving for the price equilibrium, of course we have to again derive the new demand equation and the new supply equations given their original equations and the change in demand and the change in supply. So to derive the new demand equation, we have to add the change in demand from the original demand equation. And the change in demand is increased by 10 units, so we will introduce plus 10. So adding this to the original demand equation, where the original equation is 72.5 minus 12.5P, we can now say that the new demand equation is 72.5 minus 12.5P plus 10. And to simplify, the new demand equation now is 82.5 minus 12.5P. This is the same procedure we will do for deriving the new supply equation. So that the new supply equation now is negative 45 plus 15P, okay, and the original supply equation is negative 25 plus 15P. So what we added is the change in supply, specifically a decrease in supply by 20 units, so that we introduced negative 20 as what was deducted from the original supply equation. So that the new supply equation now is QS sub 1 minus 20, where the QS sub 1 is the original supply equation. And the original supply equation is given by negative 25 plus 15. So the new supply equation now is negative 25 plus 15P minus 20. And simplifying, we now have negative 45 plus 15P. So we can now solve for the original price equilibrium and the original the new price equilibrium by equating the two equations, the supply equations to the demand equation. So if we want to find for the new price equilibrium, we will equate the new supply equation to the new demand equation and solve for P. And the P that we can obtain refers to the price equilibrium and the fact that what were equated are the new equations. So this price equilibrium refers to the new price equilibrium. So given now that we have the new price equilibrium and the original price equilibrium is 3.54, the new price equilibrium of 4.64 minus the original price equilibrium of 3.54 will give us a positive 1.10 pesos. So positive means increase in price equilibrium. So what happened was that because of the dominance of the change in supply, specifically decrease in supply, price equilibrium will increase. Okay, as we have said, change in supply is inversely related to the value price equilibrium. So since there is a decrease in supply, what can be expected is an increase in price equilibrium. The quantity equilibrium, of course, is expected to decrease also because quantity equilibrium is directly related to the change in supply. In the next slide, what we can show is the usual way of computing for quantity equilibrium. So what I would like to highlight here is the graph. Notice that the graph is having a large gap between supply curves and a small gap between the demand curves. That is to say that the change in supply is bigger than the change in demand. Notice also that the supply curve shifted to the left from QS1 to QS2 is a direction to the left. So the shift of the supply curve to the left illustrates the decrease in supply. What happened to the demand curve? The demand curve shifted to the right. From QD1 to QD2 is a shift to the right. So that means to say there is an increase in demand. So decrease in demand means shift of the supply curve to the left, and increase in demand means a shift of the supply of the demand curve rather to the right. So if we will graphically see the equilibrium points, original and new, the original demand or the original equilibrium point can be observed as the point of intersection between QS1 and QD1. So at that point of intersection between QS1 and QD1, that is when we specifically refer to that the quantity supplied equals to quantity demanded at that point. So the corresponding price is the price equilibrium original, and the corresponding quantity is the quantity equilibrium original. Notice that the original price equilibrium is at 3.54 pesos, and the original quantity equilibrium is 28.25 pesos. So how much is the change in price equilibrium? The change in price equilibrium is 1.10, and it is positive. Positive means increase in price equilibrium, where the new price equilibrium is 4.64 and the original price equilibrium is 3.54. Getting the difference of these two values of price equilibrium, we can derive at the value of 1.10 positive, meaning to say the price equilibrium increased by 1.10 pesos. So still the same market situation, market condition. Computing for the quantity equilibrium original and new quantity equilibrium is now easier to be determined. So no further explanations to be done. What we can get from here is the computed value of the new quantity equilibrium of 24.5 and the computed value of the original quantity equilibrium of 28.25. So if we will compute for the change in quantity equilibrium, new quantity equilibrium of 24.5 minus the original quantity equilibrium of 28.25 will give us a difference of negative 3.75 units. Negative implies decrease in quantity equilibrium. So because the decrease in supply exceeds the increase in demand, quantity equilibrium decreases while the price equilibrium increases. So here the new price equilibrium is 4.64. Based from the graph, this 4.64 is the corresponding price level of the intersection point between the new demand curve and the new supply curve. QD2 is equal to QS2. What are the next condition? So here, both decrease in supply and decrease in demand exist. So there is a simultaneous decrease in demand and decrease in supply. And the decrease in demand, according to our problem statement, is 12 units, while a decrease in supply is 18 units. So 18 is bigger than 12. And so the change in supply by 18 is far greater than the change in demand by 12. So this is to illustrate the condition or the situation that the change in supply exceeds the change in demand. But specifically, the kind of change is either a decrease or an increase. So specifically, a decrease in supply is 18 while a decrease in demand is 12. So given the original equations of demand and supply, adding to it their change in demand or change in supply, we can derive the new demand equation and the new supply equations. So in this slide, the new demand equation is given by 60.5 minus 12.5p, while the new supply equation is equal to negative 43 plus 15p. And so we are now ready to solve for the original price equilibrium and the new price equilibrium. So there is no difference on the way how we can derive for the value of original price equilibrium or the new price equilibrium. So we just have to equate the supply equation to the demand equation. For the original price equilibrium competition, we have to equate the original supply equation to the original demand equation. While if we find for the new price equilibrium, we have to equate the new supply equation to the new demand equation. And if we solve for the change in price equilibrium, therefore, we have an increase in price equilibrium by 0.25 centavos. And this is this value can be traced from the difference of the new price equilibrium of 3.76 and the old or original price equilibrium of 3.54. Notice also graphically that both demand and supply shifted to the left. So notice that the new supply curve is to the left of the original supply curve. So specifically the shift is to the left, and the shift to the left means decrease in supply. Also observe that the demand curve shifted to the left also from QD1 curve to QS2 curve. So both have shifted, but the shift in supply exceeds the shift in demand, as shown by a bigger gap between the new supply curve from the new or the original supply curve. we only have a smaller gap between the original demand curve and the new demand curve. The quantity equilibrium can be solved in the following slide, but I will no longer explain much about how the new quantity equilibrium was derived. So we can just specify the shift, okay, the movement of quantity equilibrium. Quantity equilibrium actually moved to the left, or move to the left, and that means there is a decrease in quantity equilibrium. And how much is the decrease in quantity equilibrium? It's negative 14.75 units. Okay, and negative means decrease in quantity equilibrium.